When I was told that if Richard Dawkins didn't show up for this debate, I would have 3 Oxford panelists responding to me instead, I was wishing and hoping that Richard Dawkins would show up. 3 on 1 seemed to me much worse odds than 1 on 1, and I think you could see why. But I thank the panelists for their interesting and provocative responses. 2 of the arguments that I discussed were mentioned by the panelists, the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument. Let me say in response to Daniel Kame that if I do sometimes seem too bold in my assertion of these arguments, it's simply because I am really convinced that the premises are true. I think that the evidence for these premises is very good, but that doesn't mean you need to have that sort of boldness. You can simply say that these arguments make it reasonable to believe that a personal creator and designer of the universe exists, and that's enough. Now, what about the premise that the universe began to exist? Here both Dr. Kame and Dr. Parrington object that there may be and are models of the universe in which there is a prior contracting phase to this present expansion. But the problem with those sorts of oscillating theories are at least twofold. First, thermodynamically, they face a very difficult problem, namely entropy is conserved from cycle to cycle. And that has the effect of generating a longer cycle time and a larger expansion radius with each cycle, so that as you trace the cycles back in time, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until you finally come to a beginning. So that such a model has an infinite future, but not an infinite past. Secondly, as the universe recontracts, it encounters quantum fluctuations. This is called BKL chaos, which would prevent the subsequent expanding phase. Here's what Alexander Vilenkin says about this. He says, you can avoid the theorem by postulating the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there is nothing wrong with having contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so it would never make it to the expanding phase. And that's exactly why infinitely precise fine-tuning is required on these oscillating models. So I don't think that these really do help to restore a plausibly tenable model of an infinite past. Now, Dr. Kame also interacts with the philosophical argument for the finitude of the past. How can we get to today if there has to be an infinite number of prior events occur first? Notice he doesn't ever answer that question. He just says that sometimes our intuitions fail. Well, sure, sometimes, but it seems to me that it's quite reasonable to go with your intuitions unless and until you have some defeater for them, some reason to think that that's not the case, and we don't have that sort of a defeater. Now he says, but you can have an infinite series of negative numbers. How is that any different? Well, the critical difference between numbers and events in time is the tense of the events. As Dr. Preece emphasized, there's a property of nowness or presentness. There's temporal becoming, whereas numbers just exist tenselessly, timelessly as it were. So there is no successive synthesis to get to a certain number by enumerating them first. In fact, what it would be more like would be someone who claims to have counted down all the negative numbers ending at 0 today, -3, -2, -1. Whew. And such a task, it seems to me, is absurd, because before any number could be counted, there would always be another number that would have had to have been counted first. So the problem lies in temporal becoming. He says, but don't we have examples of actual infinites in the spatial continuum? I would say no. There's no reason whatsoever to think that space is really continuous. It can be modeled as continuous mathematically, but there's no grounds for thinking that space really is continuous in the way described. I would agree with Aristotle that a line or a distance is logically prior to any subdivisions that we make on the line. So that this is merely an infinity in potentiality, not an actuality. By contrast, an infinite past would be an infinite series of actual events of similar duration piling up without beginning, and then it really does occasion all sorts of interesting problems. I'd love to give some more examples, but time is fleeting. So I don't think we've got any good reasons for denying either the philosophical or scientific evidence for the beginning. What about the fine-tuning of the universe? Here it was suggested that we can appeal to multiverse models, but I dealt with that. In order to be qualitatively simple, you need to have a single, simple mechanism that generates the many worlds. Otherwise, it's not simple, and I examined the mechanisms Dawkins proposes and showed that they're inadequate. So the world ensemble is not qualitatively simple in the absence of some simple mechanism. Dr. Kaim also mentions that we would be positing a new kind of entity by positing an intelligent designer. Well, that's clearly not true. We posit intelligent designers and minds all the time for artifacts that we discover. In this case, we would simply be saying that there's a cosmic intelligence or designer, but it's a familiar inference that we make all the time. Now, Dr. Parrington says, well, Victor Stenger tries to deny fine-tuning. With all due respect to Professor Stenger, whom I have debated on this subject, I think his conclusions about the fine-tuning are erroneous, and frankly, they are rejected by the vast majority of physicists. Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, says that everywhere physicists look, they see more examples of fine-tuning. This is highly unlikely to disappear with any future physics. Dr. Parrington says, well, but you could have some non-human life. Certainly you could. We're talking about any kind of interactive life. And in the absence of fine-tuning, what you need to understand is you wouldn't even have matter. You wouldn't even have chemistry, much less planets, where life of any sort could evolve. In the absence of fine-tuning, you have just utter waste. He says, well, this is an appeal to ignorance. No, it's not. It's an appeal to which of these three alternatives, physical necessity, chance, or design, is the best explanation. And I think there are substantive objections to physical necessity or chance. This is by no means simply an appeal to ignorance. He says, but this being is unknowable. Why think that it's God? Note that I didn't infer to God. I said there's a designer of the universe. Whether or not that designer is God is going to be a further step. Moreover, I think we do know some of the attributes of this cosmic intelligence. It would clearly be an intelligent being. It would therefore be a personal being. It would be an enormously smart being in order to design the laws of physics and the constants and quantities of nature. That gives us part of a cumulative case for theism. Dr. Parrington says Darwin showed that we don't need a creator. Even if that were true for biological complexity, the thing about the fine-tuning argument is that it does an end run around biological evolution and goes right back to the cosmic initial conditions. In order for Darwinian evolution to take place, you have to have this incomprehensibly complex balance of initial conditions and constants given in the Big Bang itself. And any improbability of life arising through genetic mutation and natural selection just layers on more improbability. So this argument is immune to all of the emotionally laden debates concerning creationism and evolution. So I think this argument also is a very plausible argument. I don't know of any good reason to think that physical necessity or chance are better explanations than design. Finally, Dr. Priest's interesting comments. He thinks that philosophy exists through a misconception of spirituality and that philosophy is stalled. And here I have to simply beg to disagree. I think that philosophy, and particularly from a Christian point of view, is an exercise in which Christians should be deeply engaged. I take it that Anselm was right in affirming fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. And philosophy is rightly a handmaid of theology, which can be very useful. And I would note that over the last 50 years in Anglo-American philosophy, there has been a veritable renaissance of Christian philosophy that is changing the face of this discipline, so that philosophy, far from being stalled, I think is being renewed. And I'm very enthusiastic about what is happening in that regard. One of the other, well, he asks, why is it now? Now, it seems to me that that question is trivial. That's like saying, why is it here? Why is it now? Now, it has to be now. That's a trivial question. The more interesting question is, why is it now? I think that is a philosophically significant question. And I've written an article on this, actually, and I think that the best mileage you can go toward answering that is that there was a beginning to time, that there was a beginning to the universe. Otherwise, it becomes inexplicable why, out of all the infinite moments of past time, it's now. Why this moment? Why 2011 is now? So I think this is one more reason to think the past is finite. He asks, what is being? And contrasts being with beings. But here I have to respectfully disagree and say I do think that God is a being. God is a personal being who is the creator and designer of the universe and the locus of absolute goodness, whom we can know by acquaintance, as he said. But there's no reason to think that one compromises God's necessity or aseity by affirming that God is a literal being. Now, he's not, as one British journalist remarked, a chap. I think that's right. We shouldn't think of God as a sort of chap. But nevertheless, he is a necessary being who is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused, perfectly good, omnipotent, omniscient, and all of the rest of these superlative attributes. And finally, he asks, why is something you? And I would take this to be equivalent to the question, why do you exist? Why is something you is the same as saying, why do you exist? And I would find the answer to that question in God's providence and purpose. He has a plan for your life, and it's important as we go through life that we not miss that purpose for which God created us. Thank you.
Surely, if everything that begins to exist is true, then it's true in space and time. Yet the universe isn't in space and time, but is space and time. So why does it need to be subject to a law inside itself? I think you get the idea.
I do. I think that this is a very common mistake of thinking of the principle of causality as a sort of physical law which holds only in the universe, but not of the universe, sort of like the law of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. But the causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause is not a physical principle. It is a metaphysical principle that basically says being doesn't come from non-being. Being only arises from being. And that seems to me to be an extraordinarily plausible principle that's been recognized from the time of Parmenides. Non-being has no properties, no potentialities, no powers. For the idea that being could arise from non-being is really worse than magic when you think about it. So it seems to me that Parmenides and these other Greek philosophers like Plato were quite right in thinking that being only arises from being. So that there's something that begins to exist, there needs to be some other actual being that is responsible for bringing it into existence. And that's a metaphysical principle that would certainly apply to the universe as a whole. If the universe began to exist and came into being, it surely has some sort of transcendent cause which would explain why it came into existence and therefore exists rather than nothing.
How can you reconcile God's unchangeable nature with his inconsistent dealings with humankind? How do you reconcile the doctrine of the Trinity with divine simplicity? So the issue, God's immutability, simplicity, are they consistent with other characteristics attributed to God? Yeah. Over to you.
I don't think that God is unchangeable. So the question is based on an assumption I don't hold. What I argued was that without the universe, we must get back to a changeless first cause. But notice I didn't say unchangeable, just de facto changeless. But in fact, I think at the moment of creation, God enters into time in virtue of his causal relationship with the world, and then sustains relationships with the world from that moment on. So my own studied view is that God is changeless and timeless without the universe, but changing and temporal since the beginning of time and the creation of the universe. Now, I don't think God acts inconsistently in a moral sense. It seems to me that he is always acting consistently with his own nature, so that's not a problem. But I do think God changes in his activities, in his knowledge, as time goes on. Again, with respect to the Trinity, I don't hold to a strong doctrine of divine simplicity. You need to understand that the doctrine of divine simplicity advocated by the high medieval theologians was a radical doctrine which says that God literally has no properties, that there is no distinction in him between his essence, what he is, and his existence, that he is. And I don't hold to that sort of radical view. I think that God is simple in the way that I described in response to Richard Dawkins, namely, he's not a physical object made of parts. But I would say that God has a diversity of properties, omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection. These are not the same property. And I think that God is a trinity of persons. So I don't hold to the doctrine of divine simplicity that the medievals did, and I don't think that this is a doctrine that's biblical in any case. This is an imposition on biblical theology that springs out of Neoplatonism and the conception of God as the one who is beyond all diversity and complexity. So those would be simply some theological views that I don't share.
Don't make yourself too comfortable. If consciousness is just a material phenomenon, does it disprove God, or at least the soul? Another question in the same spirit. Aren't your arguments misleading when it comes to unembodied minds? Doesn't science tell us that there are only embodied minds?
Well, science certainly doesn't tell us that there are only embodied minds. What scientific evidence is that there are no unembodied minds? You would have to have scientific evidence against the existence of God, because that's what God would be if he exists, would be an unembodied mind. There is no such evidence. So certainly science doesn't disprove the reality or the possibility of unembodied minds, or even disembodied minds. Say people when they die and the soul is separated from the body. There's nothing that proves that there are no such things as disembodied souls after death. So no, that doesn't disprove it. Now, if consciousness were shown to be either merely a physical phenomenon or something that was dependent upon a physical substratum, would that disprove God? There are Christian materialists, actually, like Peter Van Inwagen and Nancy Murphy, who are not dualists as I am. I am a substance dualist who thinks there's a difference between the soul and the body. But there are Christian philosophers and theologians who are materialists when it comes to human being. And they would say that God is of a different order than human beings, that God, in fact, is an immaterial spiritual being, but that he's quite different from human beings. That's not my own view, but I think we have to make room for such people because they do exist. There are Christian materialists, whether they're right or wrong, they're out there. And so I don't think you can say it's flatly inconsistent, but you would have to allow on that view that human beings and God would be radically diverse from each other, because God would be an example of a consciousness that doesn't have a material substratum, where these philosophers would think that human beings are. I would prefer to say that, in fact, You cannot offer a reductive materialist or even a sort of supervenient, non-reductive materialist view of the soul, the mental life, intentionality, mental causation, and so forth. And so I would hold that God and human beings are similar in the sense of being spirits, in one case embodied, in the other case unembodied.
Now a couple of questions, representative of some others, on the problem of evil. And one, why did your infinitely smart designer invent, is it evil? You get the idea.
From a Christian perspective, God didn't invent evil. Rather, he created free moral agents who have the ability either to obey God and do his will, or to seek lesser goods rather than have their wills oriented toward God as the supreme good. And evil, as I understand it, is a privation of right order in the creaturely will. It is an absence of being correctly ordered toward God as the supreme good and focused instead on lesser goods. So evil is the byproduct of the misuse of human freedom, which is necessary for us to be moral agents who make significant moral choices. Apart from that, we would be mere animals or robots or puppets, and that's not the kind of being that God wants.